So, been a hell of a week for the Big 12, huh? A week that really starts with Oklahoma and Texas deciding they want to saunter off into the sunset together as strange rival lovers off to the SEC. They tell the Big 12 conference that, yeah, we're not going to redo our grant of rights with you. Then they officially announce to the SEC, we are going to petition for membership within your conference. Then leads into the midweek drama this week for the Big 12, which included the Big 12 sending a cease and desist letter to ESPN, one of its major media partners. Then Bob Bowlesby, the most electrifying man in sports entertainment today, throwing barbs all over the place, taking shots at ESPN, taking shots at other conferences. He takes some shots at Texas and Oklahoma as the rivals turned best buddies all of a sudden are walking their way out of the conference. Needless to say, that enough would make for pretty much the craziest week in quite some time for college athletics, let alone for the Big 12. Then you factor in some of the other reports that came in during the week. You have, as I mentioned, Bob Bowlesby throwing barbs all over the place, including at ESPN, and he insinuates that ESPN is trying to break up the conference essentially from the inside. He says that ESPN is working with other conferences, with its partner conferences, to try to pluck members of the Big 12 out of their current conference and into a new one. Then that turns into Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports, friend of 580 Sports Talk, who comes out with a report and he says the American Athletic Conference has interest in poaching anywhere from 3 to 5 teams out of the Big 12. If that wasn't enough, fast forward then all the way up until right around midnight, Wednesday into Thursday, when then Dennis Dodd throws out another report. Hey, by the way, the American, according to the Big 12, actually wants to take all of our members and absorb all of them. Got all that? Whole lot going on in the Big 12 this week, but it makes you wonder. That theory that the Big 12 has that the American wants to poach all of their teams, is that really that bad of an idea? Now, obviously, there is some taint on this whole situation when you consider the fact that the American Athletic Conference, now who is their main media partner? That's right, ESPN. Now, this is obviously super problematic in a lot of ways that ESPN is trying to dive in and tear apart these conferences. It's also something that has a precedent. You go back to just about a decade ago, and ESPN was doing this same exact kind of thing to the Big East. They tore it bit by bit, thought it was dead, changed things around, wanted to help out their own media partners, and all of a sudden, the Big East, as we used to know it, no longer exists. So this is not anything new for ESPN. In fact, this is something that they are well versed in. You go back even earlier on in this past decade, midway through the decade, and you can see ESPN trying to stick its little sticky fingers all over the college football realignment map, teasing the Big 12 as a conference that was going to add people, making sure some money was thrown at Oklahoma and Texas to make sure that they stayed in the Big 12. But even with that in mind, again, our initial point for today, is it really the worst idea if the current Big 12 team, so throw out Oklahoma, throw out Texas, we are just talking about the current remaining Big 12 teams after those two walk off to the SEC? Would it be the worst thing in the world if they just joined forces completely with the American? Frankly, I don't think so. For one, if you look at this from a general conference perspective and you look at it through the lens of all 8 teams that are still in the conference, you're going to keep that autonomy 5 status. You're going to keep that special autonomous standing you have with the NCAA. As it stands, you are a member of that as part of the Big 12, but that could change really at any point. You join forces with the American, you just merge instead of having your group splintered all over, and then all 8 teams, whether you're talking Kansas, Kansas State, Baylor, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, whoever else, you're going to maintain that status, which is especially valuable for the athletic departments, but for the schools as a whole as well. The Big 12 won't be there anymore. But if you're going to have teams with that kind of pull, that kind of magnitude, and granted, they're not Texas and Oklahoma, but they still have brand names, you put them in the American Athletic Conference with the lesser brands, but still semi-well-known teams that cover some of that league, you're going to get that autonomous 5 Power 5 status. That's obviously one of the biggest selling points of going through with a merger, if that is actually something that is on the table. You also have to consider the finances about this too. The Big 12, when you take out Oklahoma and Texas, is not going to be worth anything near the $37 million a year they're currently pulling in. Those two bring in the ratings for football. They bring in the cachet in other sports as well. Texas obviously has mega donors and brings in a major audience despite being Oklahoma's little brother. Oklahoma, in its own right, has been one of the best football programs in America for the better part of 2 decades at this point. So obviously, with those two gone, you are going to lose a ton of your cash windfall. You make another conference, though, you merge forces with the American, you're not going to see $37 million a year in all likelihood, but you're still going to end up with a better deal than what? If you had multiple members go off into the Mountain West, maybe you have 1 or 2 teams that end up in the American. Maybe someone gets an invitation to another Power 5 conference. Well, they're going to be okay, but that's going to make things a whole lot harder on the rest of the group. There's also one other thing here that is a minor addition, but it is something that would be at least a little nice. You get to keep all of those old school rivalries. You don't end up maybe having to split KU from K-State. You can keep Farmageddon going. You can keep the Texas schools rivalries going. The rivalry, for example, between TCU and Baylor. You can keep those things all together if you keep that group of 8 together and just squish it in with the American. So these are some of the general conference positives you could get from a move like this. As we all know, football really drives the boat here, and we'll get to basketball in a second, but when you think about football, truthfully, there's also a lot to like about how these teams would all fit together on the gridiron specifically. When you talk about just scheduling, first things first, you end up in a pretty good position. Yes, it is an absolutely massive conference at that point, assuming you're not going to trim any of the chaff off and say, all right, sorry, Tulane, back to Conference USA with you. Sorry, Tulsa, back to Conference USA with you as well. You're going to end up with a 19-team conference if you take the teams currently in the American and then you add in the teams from the Big 12. That's going to look kind of weird with that many teams, but split it into divisions and you're going to end up just fine. You could have the Big 12 division plus throw in Houston or throw in SMU. Then you have all the other teams from the American. They can all be in their one division. You get to, again, maintain all of those rivalries. The rivalries that have sprung up in the American, they can stay where they are too. And then you have the conference championship game. So scheduling, if anything, wouldn't be really a bad thing at all. In fact, it seems to make a whole lot of sense. Then also you have to throw in things like culture and conference culture. And while that stuff may not matter quite as much now as it did the last time realignment was a major issue at the dawn of the 2010s, a time period where also you were talking about media markets. How important is that going to be? Those things might not be quite as big of a deal now, but when you're talking what are the pros, what are the cons, it's still something worth bringing up. As my good friend Patrick Mahorn on Twitter said right here, it's a good cultural fit. These are schools that all kind of fit together. The styles of football are the perfect kind of clash that actually make for a really entertaining brand of the sport. So you're going to end up with a lot of good matchups. You can end up with pretty easy scheduling. And hell, you want to make it a full 20 teams? Go call BYU. Go call Boise State. You're going to be able to find someone else who can partner up and make that an even stronger conference. I know Boise State's got their own media contracts going on personally and with the Mountain West. You don't think they'd be interested in coming and playing in the new Big 12 American Conference? Or BYU? BYU loves to make sure everybody knows how important BYU is. They would at least take the call. So you've got options there. It's a really smart fit for football to decide to go in with this whole mega conference. From there, though, you also have to ask, locally speaking, is this the right thing for KU and K-State? If the question is this the best possible option for KU and K-State? The answer is a resounding no. If you're Kansas, the number one option is that you get a call from Kevin Warren and from the Big Ten offices in Rosemont, Illinois. They call you and say, we want your basketball brand. You bring in plenty of revenue, not a ton by Big Ten standards, but more than several Big Ten teams already bring in terms of annual revenue. That's according to USA Today. So yeah, the Big Ten would be interested in KU. If that were to happen, well, frankly, sorry to group unity, KU's going to bolt for the Big Ten in a heartbeat. Or maybe if the Pac-12 is the one who calls instead of the Big Ten, well, if you're KU, you're probably going to go do that as well. The same can be said for Kansas State too. If the Pac-12 did decide to go through with a group edition that would include K-State and Oklahoma State and Baylor, et cetera, like was originally reported all the way back when these realignment rumors were first starting, okay, yeah, K-State is going to bolt out for that. But as Kirk Bohls of the Austin American-Statesman said recently, he doesn't feel like there's a whole lot behind K-State getting a push into another Power 5 conference. So obviously, moving into a current Power 5 program would be the number one option for both KU and K-State. But in the event that doesn't happen, and it's somewhat to fairly to mostly likely that won't happen, you need to have another plan. And the best course of action there is going to be unity. It is going to be keeping the group together to keep your value, to keep those rivalries, to keep the money you do have, to have some sort of bargaining power as a group. That is something that is going to be very important for KU and for K-State. Sure, it probably won't be as lucrative as getting in on a Pac-12 or a Big Ten media contract, but frankly, again, it's still better than getting splintered off and being just one of 2 or 3 teams that move into the American or the Mountain West, et cetera, et cetera. There is absolutely no guarantee that something good will happen if you wait and sit on your hands all the way until 2025, when Texas and Oklahoma at the very last second could possibly leave the conference. They might want to bolt right now, so you've got to have a plan for right now. It's not the sexiest. It probably wouldn't be the most lucrative for each individual school, but it is absolutely a better option than getting left out in the cold. You would be remiss if you don't also talk about the potential drawbacks of this. Number one that stands out before we even get into the real nitty-gritty, dirty part of the sport, basketball would be weird as hell. You're going to end up with KU and K-State, for one, in the same conference as Wichita State for basketball and baseball and all of the other sports that are going on. That would be weird. That would be strange. Would it be cool? Sure. Would it also be strange? Yeah, absolutely. Now, that's not necessarily a negative. In fact, there are probably plenty of people around the Sunflower State that would be all for that. But it does go into the general topic that basketball and the scheduling in other sports would indeed be weird as hell. You're going to end up with the Kansas Jayhawks playing a road game every other year at Tulane. You're going to end up with all sorts of weird matchups between East Carolina and K-State. And sorry, Wildcat fans, that might be the worst rated basketball game of the entire year. It's just the reality of the situation. Also, just throw in the fact the American is not a good conference. Sure, you throw in Houston, which made a run to the Final Four. Yeah, Wichita State has a good program, and you're going to get plenty of intrigue with KU and K-State facing Wichita State every year. But up and down, that is not an especially good league. And for a conference in the Big 12 that does love its basketball and does have a great basketball heritage and some really entertaining programs in it, that would be a negative for a lot of people. You also have to throw in this when it comes to the scheduling. And I just mentioned KU playing at Tulane in basketball, K-State going on the road to Orlando to play UCF, going to play USF, East Carolina, whoever else. Those are going to be long trips. Those are going to be crazy trips. Those would be hard things to reconcile for your non-revenue sports, for your Olympic sports. It is going to be harder to justify traveling halfway across the country every single week for baseball games, for softball games, tennis matches, whatever it might be. Now, if you were asking me to set up the conferences, well, we would have different conferences across Division I for football, for basketball, and then for the Olympic and non-revenue sports. They'd all be in different kinds of conferences. Is that going to happen? No. So you end up in a situation like this. That travel is definitely a major negative for a lot of teams in the Big 12, pretty much only excluding West Virginia. And, of course, travel is annoying when you have to go long distances, but more importantly than anything, that's just a huge cost that all of these other schools are going to have to incur. And the same thing goes the other way for what it's worth. If you are East Carolina, you're probably not excited to all of a sudden be traveling more than halfway across the country to go play basketball games in Lubbock, Texas. Not exactly the most exciting trip, and that is a very long and a very costly trip for these schools or any of the schools in these two conferences together. Plus, you have to throw this in there as well. You don't get to have the maximum punishment and enforce the maximum agony possible on Texas and Oklahoma. There is something petty about the way this is all falling apart for both of these sides, for the Big 12 side and for the OU and OU's little brother side. They are trying to bolt. They'll use their money, they'll use SEC money to get out of the grant of rights, to get out of their contract with the Big 12 as soon as they possibly can to go start playing football with the big boys in the SEC. There is something about the way they're leaving and the way that Bob Bowlesby finally has approached going after these teams over the last couple of days that makes you as a Big 12 fan say, no, I want them to suffer. I want to take them to court. I want them to have to sit in the Big 12 for the next 4 years and stay there in a conference they don't want to be in so they can travel to us. Our fans can boo them. We can beat them and rub their face in it on their way out the door. And more importantly than anything, so that they can make big money in New Year's Six bowl games, in playoff games, with all their donor money and all of that. And it continues to be paid out to us. There is something to that. And I think quite literally something very valuable to that. You bolt for the American within the next 1, 2, even 3 years, you're not going to reap the peak benefits of that. Is it petty? Sure. Does it make financial sense? Sure. And frankly, do you want to rub Oklahoma and Texas' face and everything they've done to you? Yeah, you absolutely do. In the end, with all of this, you have to make sure you take care of yourself first. If you're the University of Kansas and you get a call from the Big Ten, you've got to go. You cannot be worried about what Kansas State or Oklahoma State, Iowa State, TCU, you cannot be worried about what they are doing. You've got to watch out for your own backside. And if that is KU getting a call from the Big Ten, K-State getting a call from the Pac-12, you must go do it. But in case those number one peak dream options don't work out, you need a backup plan. You need to have conference unity. Those 8 schools would need to stick together. So what would you rather have it end up being? You all get split up in 2025 and you have some schools scattered about the Mountain West, some in the American, maybe someone goes to a Power 5. Everybody ends up losing essentially in that case, except for maybe one team. You can stick together and be a conference of just 8. Maybe you bring in Cincinnati and Houston or SMU and UCF, something like that. Or do you just decide to bite the bullet, make sure you take care of everybody financially, at least to a degree, and you end up in what should be a pretty entertaining and exciting football conference? There are different levels to this for fans, for media members, and for the league itself and its administrators in the member schools. But frankly, as crazy as it sounded when Dennis Dodd first put on Twitter on Wednesday night that, hey, look out, the Big 12 thinks the American wants to absorb all of its teams, as crazy as that was to hear, there are far worse options for what could happen to KU, to K-State, and to the rest of the Big 12.